Discovery Channel has broadcast every season of Blind Frog Ranch. They have put Dwayne Ollinger's underground discoveries, his equipment failures, his flooded excavations, and his relentless pursuit of something beneath the Utah desert in front of an audience without hesitation, which makes the existence of a pulled episode removed before a single viewer could watch it, never acknowledged, never discussed by anyone connected to the production, the most significant thing the show has ever produced. Subscribe and stay until the end, because this episode changes everything. To understand the full weight of what it means that a Blind Frog Ranch episode was pulled before it could air and has never been discussed by anyone connected to the production, it is necessary to first establish what Discovery Channel has already been willing to broadcast across the show's run, because the baseline of what the network approved and transmitted to its audience defines the threshold that the pulled episode crossed. Discovery Channel built a franchise around a Utah rancher who spent years drilling into ground that fought back, pulling anomalous materials from excavations that should not have contained them, documenting an underground water system of a scale and a character that no geological model for the region could account for, and pursuing a subterranean mystery whose implications, as the show's most serious viewers have understood across every season, extend well beyond the buried gold that the surface-level framing of the production presents as its primary objective. The network was comfortable broadcasting all of that. They were comfortable putting Dwayne Ollinger's recovered metallic fragments, materials that field analysis could not match to any known ore deposit in the Uintah Basin, on camera and in front of an audience. They were comfortable broadcasting the sonar returns from the underground void network, whose geometry the investigation's geological consultants described with the careful language of professionals who understood what they were implying. They were comfortable broadcasting the physical effects on crew members in specific zones of the property and the equipment failures that correlated with those zones in patterns too consistent for mechanical explanation. That is what made it to air. That is the threshold every broadcast episode cleared. The pulled episode did not clear it. The same network that had been broadcasting the most significant underground paranormal investigation in American television history reviewed one specific episode and made the decision that it could not be transmitted to an audience under any circumstances. The speed of that decision and the totality of the silence that has surrounded it since are the two most important facts about what the pulled episode contains. The broadcast history of Blind Frog Ranch is not a series of independent excavation stories assembled into episodic television. It is a progressive narrowing, a season-by-season reduction of the distance between Dwayne Ollinger's drilling operation and whatever has been sitting beneath the surface of his Utah property since long before he arrived. The earliest seasons established the foundation of the mystery, the anomalous sonar returns, the equipment failures at specific depths, the metallic materials recovered from early excavations whose composition field analysis could not account for, and the flooding events that terminated promising drilling attempts with a consistency that ruled out ordinary geological bad luck as their explanation. Each of those early findings was significant in isolation. In sequence, they established a picture of a property whose underground environment was not passive. It was not simply a geological formation that happened to contain unusual materials. It was something that produced resistance to investigation in direct proportion to how close that investigation came to its most significant features. The middle seasons deepened that picture. The constructed chamber that the excavation team accessed, with its geometric consistency, its treated wall surfaces, and the markings that no archaeological consultant could identify, introduced a dimension to the Blind Frog Ranch investigation that the early seasons had pointed toward without directly reaching. The revelation that whatever was underground had been built rather than formed, that the subterranean environment beneath Dwayne's property bore evidence of construction rather than natural geological process, was the most significant single development the broadcast seasons produced, and the finding that most directly connected the ranch's underground investigation to the broader Uintah Basin phenomenon documented at adjacent properties. The later seasons pushed further. The connection between the underground structures and the aerial and electromagnetic phenomenon documented on the surface was established with increasing precision. The Uinta Basin context, the correspondence between what the Blind Frog Ranch excavation was finding underground and what the Skinwalker Ranch investigation had been mapping with sonar on the adjacent property, gave the investigation a regional significance that the single property treasure hunt framing the network applied to it had always undersold. The pulled episode is what happened when the investigation finally produced something that the regional significance framing could no longer contain. The investigation documented in the pulled episode was not a standard excavation session targeting the underground formation that the prior seasons had been systematically approaching. It was triggered by a specific event, A change in the surface conditions of the ranch that the monitoring infrastructure Dwayne's team had installed produced data about in the days preceding the filming session that indicated something had changed in the underground environment without any corresponding drilling or excavation activity having caused it. The change was not dramatic in the way that the broadcast episode's most significant moments have been dramatic. It was not visible on the surface. It was visible only in the instrument data, a shift in the electromagnetic profile of a specific zone of the property, a change in the ground vibration signature that the sensors had been logging continuously, and a thermal anomaly detected in the same zone that the prior monitoring baseline had not shown. Something underground had moved, not shifted in the geological sense of settling or water table fluctuation. The technical team's analysis of the data had ruled those explanations out within hours of the anomaly appearing in the monitoring record. Something had moved in the directed sense. Something beneath the surface of Blind Frog Ranch had changed its position relative to the monitoring infrastructure above it, and the change had been large enough and specific enough to show up clearly in 3 independent instrument categories simultaneously. Dwayne's response to that data, documented in the production's pre-session footage, was the response of a man who had spent years being told by the underground environment of his property exactly what it was willing to show him and exactly what it was not. He understood what the data was indicating. He understood what the filming session was going to pursue, and the quality of his composure during the pre-session preparation footage communicates to anyone who has watched him across the prior seasons closely enough to read his baseline that he was not entirely certain the investigation was going to produce something he was prepared to document on camera. The filming session that produced the pulled episode began with the systematic approach to the zone where the instrument anomaly had been detected, a section of the property that the prior season's investigation had treated as a transition zone between the more extensively documented eastern section of the underground formation and a western extension whose sonar returns had been ambiguous enough to defer direct investigation in favor of consolidating the evidence from the better mapped sections first. The instrument readings in that transition zone on the morning of the filming session were consistent with what the monitoring data had shown in the days preceding it. Elevated electromagnetic variance, a structured ground vibration signature at the depth corresponding to the upper boundary of the underground formation, and a thermal profile at the surface that the prior monitoring baseline identified as anomalous without providing a conventional geological explanation for the anomaly. The excavation approach to the zone was methodical. The same combination of ground-penetrating radar confirmation, structural stability assessment, and incremental penetration that the prior season's drilling work had established as the operational framework for approaching the underground formation without triggering the catastrophic equipment failures and flooding events that had terminated earlier attempts. The ground-penetrating radar work conducted in the initial phase of the session returned imagery of the subsurface environment in the transition zone that the investigation's geological consultant examined in real time with a quality of attention that the session cameras documented with the intimacy of a production that had been filming this team long enough to recognize when something in the data was producing a response that exceeded the consultant's professional baseline. What the radar showed in the transition zone was not consistent with what the prior sonar work had suggested would be there. The ambiguity that had characterized the prior sonar returns for this zone was not, as the team had assumed, evidence of a simpler or less significant underground structure than what had been found in the eastern section. It was evidence of something whose character was different enough from the eastern formation that the sonar methodology had not resolved it clearly. The radar resolved it, and what it showed the team in the transition zone changed the direction of the filming session from a systematic excavation approach to something that nobody in the production had a prepared protocol for. The specific nature of what the Blind Frog Ranch cameras captured during the pulled episode filming session is the element of this story whose details have been most carefully protected by everyone connected to the production, the network, and the suppression decision that followed the footage review. What has surfaced through the research surrounding the pulled episode is not a complete description of what the cameras documented, but a set of consistent characterizations from independent sources whose positions in relation to the production and the suppression decision give their accounts different but complementary perspectives on the same event. The ground-penetrating radar imagery from the transition zone, the imagery that changed the direction of the session, showed a void structure whose dimensions and whose specific geometric characteristics were inconsistent with every prior underground feature the investigation had documented at the ranch and inconsistent with any natural formation category the geological consultant's reference database contained. The void was large. Its internal geometry was not the rough asymmetry of a natural cave system, or even the relative consistency of the constructed chamber the prior seasons had accessed. It was precise in a manner that the consultant's field notes, the portions that have been referenced in the accounts of people familiar with the production's internal record, describe as exceeding the precision of the eastern chamber by a margin that suggested a different order of construction capability, rather than a different expression of the same capability. What the cameras documented when the excavation reached the boundary of that void, when the physical separation between the investigation and whatever the void contained was reduced to a matter of feet rather than meters, is described across every independent account that has surfaced as a sequence of events lasting approximately 7 minutes, whose content has no reference point in the entire prior history of the Blind Frog Ranch investigation. The Dwayne Ollinger visible in the session cameras during those 7 minutes is not the Dwayne Ollinger who has spent seasons on television pursuing the underground mystery of his property with the stubborn, practically oriented determination that has defined his public character across every prior moment the cameras have captured. What the cameras document during those 7 minutes produced the footage review response that pulled the episode, and the response was made by people who watched those 7 minutes and understood immediately that there was no version of them that could be broadcast. The footage from the pulled episode filming session was transferred to the production's post-production system within the standard operational timeline following the session's conclusion. What distinguished the subsequent process from every prior episode's post-production workflow was the speed at which the footage's review escalated beyond the normal editorial chain and the specific character of the communications that escalation produced. The production editor assigned to the initial raw footage review documented the session footage in sequence, establishing shots, excavation approach footage, geological consultant analysis segments, before reaching the transition zone sequence and the 7-minute window that the cameras had captured at the void boundary. The escalation from the editorial level to the senior production executive level that followed that initial review happened within hours and was communicated in terms whose urgency was recognized by everyone in the chain as indicating something beyond a standard content concern. The senior producer's review of the relevant sequence produced the escalation to the production company's executive level that same day. The production company's communication to Discovery Channel came within 24 hours of the initial raw footage review. The network's response, delivered at an organizational level above the standard production executive chain, was received by the production company before the end of the business day following their communication to the network. Every step in that chain happened faster than the standard operational tempo of a production company. A network of those sizes allows for when the decision being made involves content whose implications require careful deliberation. The speed indicates that deliberation was not what the review process produced. It indicates that everyone in the chain who saw the relevant footage reached the same conclusion before they had finished watching it, and that the subsequent communications were not the process of arriving at a decision, but the process of implementing one that had already been made. Discovery Channel's instruction to the production was total. The episode did not exist. The footage was to be removed from the accessible production archive. The filming session was not to be referenced in any subsequent production communication. The silence that has surrounded the pulled episode since that instruction was issued has been maintained by everyone in the chain with a completeness that reflects not the ordinary confidentiality of a commercial production, but the specific kind of managed silence that is produced when the people being asked to maintain it understand exactly why it is necessary. The suppression of the Blind Frog Ranch pulled episode does not occur in isolation from the broader pattern of information management that has characterized every serious investigation of the Uintah Basin's most significant properties across the entire documented history of the region's anomalous phenomenon. The ranch sits in the same geographic basin as Skinwalker Ranch. It sits above the same underground formation system that the Skinwalker Ranch sonar has been mapping from the eastern side, while the Blind Frog Ranch excavation has been approaching from the western side. The correspondence between what the two investigations have been finding, the geometric consistency of the underground structures, the electromagnetic anomalies concentrated above them, the physical effects on investigators operating in their vicinity, and the resistance both investigations have encountered when approaching the most significant sections of the underground network, is too specific across too many independent evidence categories to be the product of coincidence. Whatever the Blind Frog Ranch cameras documented during the pulled episode session is not a property-specific event. It is a basin-wide event that happened to be captured by one specific investigation's cameras at one specific moment in the region's documented history. The government programs that have engaged with the Uintah Basin's phenomenon, the AAWSAP initiative that designated Skinwalker Ranch as its primary research site, and whose classified geographic assessment of the broader basin included references to significant underground structures in the general area of both properties, had an interest in the information environment around the basin's most active investigation sites that predates the current broadcast productions. Whether that interest extended to the specific footage the Blind Frog Ranch cameras captured during the pulled episode session, whether the speed and the totality of the Discovery Channel suppression decision reflects purely internal network judgment or reflects the application of a protocol whose parameters were established by parties outside the commercial television structure, is a question whose answer the available record points toward without providing directly. What it provides directly is the pattern, and the pattern of how the most significant evidence produced by investigations of this region has been handled across every program that has engaged with it seriously enough to get close to what it contains is consistent enough to constitute its own form of answer. The Blind Frog Ranch pulled episode survived the suppression decision through the same mechanism that has allowed significant evidence from managed investigations to survive the institutional processes designed to prevent its public availability. The decision of a single person in the production chain to retain a copy of material they understood was being buried for reasons that went beyond the ordinary exercise of editorial judgment. The copy that has surfaced is not a finished episode cut. It is raw session footage, the unedited camera output from the units running during the filming session, including the transition zone sequence and the 7-minute window at the void boundary that produced the suppression decision. The authenticity of the footage has been established through the digital forensics process applied to the file. The production metadata is consistent with the Blind Frog Ranch production timeline. The camera identification data matches the equipment manifest for the relevant filming session, and the footage does not show evidence of post-production alteration or composite manipulation. What the raw footage establishes, across its full runtime from the pre-session preparation footage through the excavation approach to the transition zone and into the 7-minute sequence, is a complete record of what the Blind Frog Ranch investigation encountered on the day the pulled episode was filmed. The pre-session footage establishes the ordinary professional context of a filming day that began like every prior season's filming days began. The excavation approach footage documents the methodical, technically competent investigation process that the show's prior seasons had established as the production's operational standard. The transition zone radar imagery documents the specific finding that changed the session's direction, and the 7-minute sequence documents what the investigation reached when it arrived at the boundary of what that radar imagery had identified. Taken as a body of evidence, as a continuous record of a single day's investigation that began in the ordinary register of the show's prior production history and ended somewhere that nothing in that history had established a framework for, the raw footage is the most complete account of what the Blind Frog Ranch underground investigation has ever produced, and it is complete precisely because it was never edited into the managed form that the broadcast episode's versions of comparable material have always taken before reaching the audience. Every season of Blind Frog Ranch that has broadcast represents the portion of the investigation's complete record that Discovery Channel determined could be shown to its audience. That portion has been remarkable, a body of underground investigation evidence that stands as the most physically substantive paranormal documentary record produced in the Uintah Basin's public investigation history. But it has always been a managed portion. The pulled episode is the evidence of that management. It establishes that the broadcast record of Blind Frog Ranch, every season, every discovery, every moment of genuine investigative significance that made it to air, was still operating within a framework that the full reality of what is beneath that Utah property cannot fit inside. The pulled episode does not contradict what the broadcast seasons documented. It contextualizes it in the same way that the Skinwalker Ranch band episode contextualizes that show's broadcast history, by establishing that what the audience was permitted to see was the investigation operating within the range the network was willing to show, and that the range stopped well short of what the investigation actually reached. Duane Ollinger spent years and a fortune pursuing something beneath his property that every conventional voice in his life told him was not there. The broadcast seasons documented that pursuit with enough honesty and enough evidentiary detail to build an audience that understood across those seasons that what was underground was real and was significant and was being approached with increasing precision. The pulled episode is the documentation of what the pursuit reached when the precision finally became adequate to reach it. Discovery Channel buried that documentation because what it showed was not something they could put in front of an audience within the format that the show had established. The format could not contain it. The network understood that immediately, and the silence that has surrounded the pulled episode since that understanding produced the suppression decision is the most honest communication about the nature of what the footage contains that anyone connected to it has ever produced. The silence has now been broken by the footage itself. What is underground at Blind Frog Ranch has been waiting for this moment since before the first camera was turned on. The investigation found it. The cameras documented it, and what was buried with the pulled episode is buried no longer.